Somewhere in the last ice age, two bands of humans are camped less than a day's walk apart. Same climate, same prey animals moving through the same valley, same tools, roughly the same numbers, the same hunger. One of those bands has a handful of dogs sleeping at the edge of the fire. The other does not. 10 winters later, one of those bands is still there. The other one isn't. Nobody wrote that story down. There was no census, no memorial, no name carved anywhere. But the pattern behind it is written into something more permanent than stone. It's written into the fact that almost every human population that made it through the last ice age intact was, at some point, running alongside a dog. And the populations that show up in the archaeological record as gaps, as silences, as sites that were occupied and then simply weren't anymore, are disproportionately the ones where dogs are missing from the evidence. This is not a story about dogs being loyal. Loyalty is the word we reach for after the fact, once the relationship is safe and sentimental. This is a colder story. It is about a filter. Somewhere between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, having a dog stopped being a lifestyle choice and started being a survival variable, the kind of variable that decides who is still around to have descendants and who isn't. And once you start looking at it that way, the question stops being why did ancient humans keep dogs? The real question is, how much of who we are today was decided by which of our ancestors had one? To understand how a dog could tip the scale between a band that survives and a band that vanishes, you have to understand what ancient survival actually depended on. It wasn't strength. Humans are not particularly strong compared to the animals we were competing with and hunting alongside. It wasn't speed. A human being outrun by almost anything with 4 legs and a reason to run. What kept a small band of Ice Age humans alive from one season to the next came down to 3 things, over and over again, in almost every reconstruction anthropologists have built. Knowing danger was coming before it arrived, successfully finding and killing enough food, and not losing people to things that could have been prevented. A dog, it turns out, was built to help with exactly those 3 things, and it was built for them before humans had anything to do with shaping it. Start with warning. A human sleeping in the open, or even inside a shelter of hide and bone, is not equipped to detect an approaching predator in the dark. Human hearing is mediocre. Human smell is close to useless by comparison to almost any carnivore on the landscape. Human night vision is poor enough that our ancestors were functionally blind for a third of every day of their lives. A wolf, or an early dog descended from one, does not share any of those weaknesses. It can hear a footstep at a distance no human ear will register. It can smell a predator's presence hours after the animal has already moved on. It can see movement in near total darkness. Put a dog at the edge of a human camp and you have not added a pet. You have added a sensory system the human body never evolved, bolted directly onto the group's ability to detect danger before danger arrives. That sounds abstract until you make it concrete. A cave lion approaching a camp at night does not announce itself. It moves low, it moves quiet, and by the time a sleeping human hears anything, the distance that mattered has already closed. A dog hears it long before that point, and a dog's response to a threat is not silence. It is noise, movement, teeth bared toward the source of danger, exactly the kind of disturbance that wakes a camp with enough time left to matter. Multiply that single night across 10,000 nights, across generations, across every predator that ever tested the edge of a human settlement looking for an opening, and you start to see the shape of the filter. A band with dogs gets more warnings. A band with more warnings loses fewer people to the dark. And it isn't only about the largest, most obvious predators either. Smaller nighttime threats, scavengers testing a camp's food stores, opportunistic predators looking for an unguarded child or elder at the edge of the group, are exactly the kind of low-grade, easily overlooked danger that a sleeping human simply cannot monitor for 8 hours a night, every night, for an entire life. A dog can. That's not a skill it had to be taught. It's a baseline the animal was already operating on before any human ever called it useful. But detection was only half of what determined whether a band ate that week, and eating that week determined almost everything else. Hunting large Ice Age prey with hand tools was not efficient. Anthropological reconstructions of hunting success rates among groups without dogs put failure on most attempts. Sometimes the overwhelming majority of attempts, meaning a band could go out, spend the energy, take the risk, and come home with nothing more times than not. That kind of math is unforgiving over a winter. A dog changes it in ways that compound. A dog can track a wounded animal for hours after a human tracker would lose the trail. A dog can hold a large animal at bay, circling and harassing it, buying the human hunter's time to close the distance safely instead of having to get dangerously close to a wounded, cornered animal on their own. A dog can flush prey out of cover a human would never think to check. None of that requires training in the way we think of training a modern dog. It only requires the animal doing what it was already inclined to do: chasing, tracking, cornering, and a human band smart enough to walk beside it instead of away from it. The numbers this produces are not subtle. Reconstructions of hunting efficiency with dogs present versus absent show increases that aren't measured in small percentages. They're measured in multiples. A band that fails on most hunts without a dog and succeeds meaningfully more often with one isn't looking at a marginal improvement in comfort. It's looking at the difference between a hungry winter and a survivable one, between a group that has enough surplus to get a sick member or an injured hunter through a bad stretch, and a group that doesn't. Calories in the Ice Age were not an abstraction. They were the entire currency the future was bought with, and a dog changed the exchange rate. Then there is the third thing, the quieter one. The one that doesn't show up in a single dramatic night or a single successful hunt, but shows up over years. It's disease, spoilage, and the small daily judgment calls that either keep a group healthy or slowly erode it. Modern research has confirmed something that would have been common knowledge to anyone who lived closely with dogs for long enough to notice it, which is that a dog's sense of smell is precise enough to detect chemical changes in decaying meat, in infected wounds, in illness itself, long before a human would notice anything wrong. A dog doesn't need to understand germ theory to avoid rotten meat and to react differently around a sick animal or a sick person. That instinct, running alongside a human band day after day, functions as a kind of early biological alarm system, the sort of thing that prevented a band from eating spoiled meat during a lean season, or noticed a change in a wounded member's condition before infection turned dangerous. None of this was medicine in any way we'd recognize. It was closer to a second set of senses, embedded permanently into the group's daily decision-making, watching for things human senses were never built to catch. There's a fourth factor, quieter still, that modern research has only recently started to measure directly, and it may matter as much as the other three combined. Chronic stress kills slowly. A human band living under constant threat, never fully able to relax, never sleeping deeply, spending every waking hour scanning the tree line, pays a real physiological cost for that vigilance over time, one that shows up as weakened immune function, poor decision-making, and fraying cooperation within the group, exactly when cooperation matters most. Studies on human-dog interaction consistently find measurable drops in cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, simply from a dog's presence nearby, alongside increases in oxytocin, the hormone tied to bonding, calm, and trust. A modern lab can measure that shift in minutes. An Ice Age band would have felt it as something harder to name but just as real. The difference between a camp that could actually rest at night and a camp that never fully could. A group that sleeps better makes better decisions the next day. A group that trusts more easily cooperates more effectively during a crisis. None of that shows up in a fossil. All of it shows up, eventually, in which bands were still cohesive enough, generations later, to still be a band at all. Put those four things together: detection, hunting success, the slow avoidance of preventable loss, and the quiet biological relief of not carrying every threat alone, and you start to understand why the presence or absence of a dog wasn't a lifestyle detail in the Ice Age. It was closer to the difference between a band operating with a full set of survival tools and a band operating with pieces missing. And bands operating with pieces missing don't necessarily die dramatically. Most of the time, they just quietly fail to keep pace. They lose a few more people to the cold nights. They come home from a few more failed hunts. They eat a few more bad meals during a hard season. None of it looks catastrophic in the moment. It just adds up, generation after generation, until one band is still there, and the other one has thinned out, fragmented, or been absorbed. And archaeology finds one site with a long, continuous story, and another site that just goes quiet. There's a comparison that makes this filter easier to see, because it isn't hypothetical. It's sitting in the fossil record. Neanderthals lived across Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, in many of the same landscapes, hunting many of the same animals, dealing with many of the same predators and the same brutal winters that early Homo sapiens were dealing with. And then, over a relatively narrow window, Neanderthals disappear from the record while our own ancestors keep expanding. There are many theories for why, and no single explanation accounts for all of it. But one detail keeps surfacing in the research, and it's this. The strongest, earliest evidence for a working partnership between humans and wolf-like canines belongs to Homo sapiens sites, not Neanderthal ones. Neanderthals were not less intelligent. They were not less capable hunters. By most measures, they were exceptionally skilled, adapted to their environment over an enormous span of time. But if one population was operating with an early warning system, a tracking partner, and an illness detector running alongside it, and the other wasn't, that is exactly the kind of quiet, compounding advantage that wouldn't show up as a single dramatic battle or a single catastrophic season. It would show up exactly the way it does in the record, as one population slowly outlasting the other across thousands of years of the same shared, difficult world. You don't need to reach back to Neanderthals to see the same filter working either. You can see a smaller, faster version of it in situations far closer to the present, where the presence or absence of a dog still measures the line between someone found and someone who isn't. Search and rescue operations in snow, in collapsed structure sites, in dense wilderness, consistently show recovery odds that shift dramatically when a trained dog is part of the search, not because the dog is stronger or faster than the human searchers, but because it is working with senses the human body was never given. A dog can locate a buried avalanche victim in minutes using scent alone, a task that can take a human search team hours with equipment, if it succeeds at all. None of that is a coincidence, and none of it is a modern invention. It's the same basic advantage that mattered beside an Ice Age campfire, still doing the same job, just in a world with better records to prove it. This is where the evidence stops being theoretical. The grave near Bonn, Germany, discovered in 1914, holding 2 humans buried alongside the remains of dogs, including a young animal that survived a severe, drawn-out illness only through what researchers believe must have been sustained human care, is usually told as a story about affection. It's a beautiful story to tell that way, but it's also evidence of something colder and more important. A community that invests scarce food and time into keeping a sick puppy alive for weeks is a community that has already learned, through hard experience, what that animal was worth to them once it recovered. You don't spend Ice Age resources on sentiment alone. You spend them on an investment you've already seen pay off, over and over, in other dogs, in other winters. The burial isn't proof of love in isolation. It's proof of a calculation that had already been run many times before. And the answer, every time, had been that the dog was worth it. And once you accept that dogs functioned as a survival multiplier rather than a companion animal, the archaeological pattern starts making a different kind of sense. Sites with early confirmed dog remains tend to show longer, more continuous human occupation. Populations that carried dogs with them into new, unfamiliar territory, crossing into regions with predators and prey animals they had never encountered before, show up in the genetic and archaeological record as populations that took root and expanded rather than populations that flickered out after a generation or two in a hostile new landscape. That is not a coincidence you can wave away. Expanding into unknown territory is exactly the kind of moment where a built-in warning system, a hunting partner, and an early illness detector would matter the most, because it's exactly the moment when a human band has the least accumulated local knowledge to fall back on. The dog didn't just help ancient humans survive familiar ground. It may have been the single factor that determined which human groups were even capable of successfully pushing into unfamiliar ground at all. Think about what that actually implies. Every time a band of ancient humans stood at the edge of somewhere new, a frozen strait, a mountain pass, a coastline they'd never seen before, the ones who had dogs beside them were the ones carrying a warning system, a hunting partner, and an early illness detector into the unknown. The ones without dogs were carrying only themselves. Migration, in other words, wasn't just a story about which humans were brave enough or desperate enough to move. It may have been a story about which humans had the support system capable of surviving the move at all. And if that's true, then dogs weren't simply present at some of humanity's most important expansions. They may have been the reason some of those expansions succeeded where others, without dogs, quietly failed and left no trace at all. The filter didn't stop running once the Ice Age ended either. It just changed shape, the same way the dog's role kept changing shape across every era of human life that followed. When hunting stopped being the difference between a fed camp and a starving one, dogs became sentinels for early settlements, standing between a vulnerable village and whatever moved through the dark outside its edges. When agriculture created herds worth protecting, dogs became the barrier between a family's entire food supply and the predators that wanted it, and a community that lost its herd to a single bad night could lose everything it had built. When humans pushed into colder, harsher, more isolated regions, dogs became the difference between a journey that was survivable and one that wasn't, pulling loads, breaking trail, and warning of danger in landscapes where a single mistake meant death. In every one of those eras, the underlying pattern never actually changed. Some humans had access to that partnership, and some didn't, and the ones who did were, quietly and repeatedly, given a better set of odds than the ones who didn't. This is the part that should sit uncomfortably with anyone who thinks of the dog purely as a pet. If dogs functioned as a genuine survival filter across tens of thousands of years of human expansion, disease, hunting failure, and predation, then the humans who are here today, the ones whose lineage survived long enough to eventually write any of this down, are disproportionately descended from the bands that had dogs, and not from the ones that didn't. Somewhere in the deep math of who lived and who didn't, an animal that couldn't speak, couldn't plan, and had no concept of the stakes it was involved in, was quietly deciding outcomes, not through intention, not through choice, simply through what it already was, an animal built to detect, to chase, to warn, and to notice what a human body couldn't. Population geneticists have a term for moments like this, when only a fraction of a population's lineages make it through to the next chapter while the rest quietly end, a bottleneck. Most bottlenecks in human prehistory get explained by climate, by disease, by catastrophe, on a scale large enough to leave an obvious mark. But bottlenecks don't require a single dramatic event. They can be built from thousands of small, unremarkable differences in survival odds, repeated across enough generations, until the math resolves itself into a population that looks, in hindsight, like it was shaped by one clear force, even though no single moment was decisive on its own. If having a dog beside a band shifted survival odds by even a small margin, and it shifted them repeatedly, across thousands of winters, thousands of hunts, and thousands of illnesses, that margin does not stay small. It compounds the same way any repeated advantage compounds, until the descendants of dogless bands become a shrinking fraction of the total, not because anyone drove them out, but because the odds were never quite even to begin with. There's a version of this story where dogs are the lucky beneficiaries of human generosity, tolerated near the fire out of pity or curiosity, until the relationship slowly became affectionate. That version isn't wrong exactly, but it puts the emphasis in the wrong place. It makes humans the deciding force, and dogs the passive recipients of human choice. The harder, stranger version, the one the evidence actually points toward, is closer to the opposite. Ancient humans weren't simply choosing to keep dogs around because they liked having them there. They were, whether they understood it this way or not, being sorted by whether they had access to that partnership at all. Bands that crossed paths with tolerant, opportunistic wolves early and didn't drive them off gained an advantage they could not have replicated on their own. Bands that never made that connection, for reasons as simple as geography or timing, were competing against the same predators, the same failed hunts, and the same preventable losses without any of the help. Over enough generations, that gap does the same thing every survival gap does. It compounds until it isn't a gap anymore. It's the entire outcome. That's the uncomfortable center of this story. We like to imagine our ancestors as the authors of their own survival, making smart choices, adapting cleverly, outlasting the Ice Age through sheer human ingenuity. Some of that is true. But sitting quietly inside that story is an animal that never asked to be included in it, that had no stake in whether any particular human band lived or died, and that nonetheless became one of the deciding variables in exactly that outcome. The wolf that didn't run from a campfire wasn't trying to save anyone, it was trying to eat. But the byproduct of that single, self-interested decision, repeated across thousands of individual animals and thousands of individual human bands over thousands of years, was a filter running quietly underneath the entire span of human prehistory, sorting bands into the ones that would leave descendants and the ones that wouldn't. Picture it the way it would have actually happened, in a single ordinary moment that no one thought was historic at the time. A band moving into unfamiliar territory as the ice retreats, uncertain ground, unfamiliar predator calls at night, prey animals whose habits nobody in the group has learned yet. Two versions of that band exist across the landscape that season, scattered in different valleys, making the same desperate calculations. In one, someone is jolted awake by a dog's low growl aimed at the tree line, and the camp survives a night it might not have survived alone. In another, there is no growl, no warning, only silence until it's too late, or a winter that runs a little too long on a little too little food, with no second set of senses working the margins in their favor. Neither band knows, in that moment, that anything decisive is happening. Nobody in either camp understands they're living through the exact process that will determine, tens of thousands of years later, whose descendants would still exist to wonder about it. That's the real answer to the question. Dogs didn't decide which ancient humans survived by choosing sides, weighing options, or understanding what was at stake. They decided it the same way a fence in an open field decides which animals stay in and which wander off. Passively, mechanically, without intention, simply by being what they already were in exactly the moments humans needed it most. Neither camp knew, in that ordinary moment, that anything decisive was happening. There was no ceremony to it, no instinct that history was choosing sides that night. It was just a growl in the dark, or the absence of one. A hunt that came home heavy, or one that came home empty for the third time that month. A wound that was noticed early, or one that wasn't noticed until it was already too late to matter. Small differences repeated often enough, until they weren't small anymore. The species that is now curled up on a rug somewhere near you wasn't rescued by ancient humans out of kindness. In more ways than we like to admit, it may have been the reason there were ancient humans left at all, for kindness to eventually reach forward through, generation after generation, until it reached you.